Okay. Well, I'll just say full disclosure. I'm reading your papers and hearing this. I'm very much a participant in the sharing economy. Being a young person in your demographic of research. But one thing I noticed in the paper going over the 4 different cases is there's kind of an education gap between people who are really involved in it and people who may potentially be involved. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on how do we reach that? How do we reach the people who aren't participating in this and we want to maybe reach more of a space of equity in class, in gender, and all those things that create a more open, accessible environment.
Education gap in terms of the education levels of participants and non-participants.
Either that, or even like I was thinking about the food swap and just the little things about like don't bring this, or in the maker space, you know, who don't know how to do something and they come in and they prove themselves, you know, just that sort of education. Maybe that's just case by case, but.
So it's closing the gap.
Yeah.
Next person was James, I think.
Sure. I have more of a clarifying question. Not that I want to get hung up on definitions, but I'm unclear in your understanding of the sharing economy, what's in, what's out, and why. And for example, I thought you were saying that Zipcar is out, and yet it's one of the case studies, and it's mentioned a few times. And Airbnb also, I thought, was out, and yet it's talked about as potentially in, and I'm not exactly sure. And again, why. I also, a related question on the key conditions. You had 2. I'm not sure I fully buy those as the most important, or even in and of themselves. Peer-to-peer. At the very end, you mentioned something about municipal servicing of basic services. Why couldn't nonprofits or institutions, educational organizations, whatever, be the sources of the sharing or help organize the sharing? And digitally enabled, you also have examples of, I guess you would call it old style sharing, but those I think are very much part of the sharing economy, whether it's a tool library, as you mentioned, a yard sale, or even a library.
Katya?
Yes, thank you. So I had a few questions, and the first basic clarifying question would be whether you have looked into meetups yet, because meetups is a way of, it's a digital link of bringing people together, but they normally meet outside. And my friends who are into coding and learning skills outside of their, neuroscience main activity that they do, they can learn for free during meetups lots of things. So do you consider this, scientific sharing as part of the shared economy? And my second question has more to do with what I do in my own work. It's about the value shift. Yeah, value shift. So my question is, do you think that the fact that people are engaging into this shared economy means that their values changed? Or is it something else, the values remain the same and something else changed?
So 2 parts. One is related to what James brought up, is what's in, what's out. The other one is bigger question of value change. Let's come back to it. Who was the...
That's 3.
That's 3.
Are you going to do more?
I can define it.
Is it a completely different thread, or is it...
It's peripheral.
Okay, so let's wait for the next thread. You will be alone.
I'm sorry. I thought you said 3, did you?
I was vague.
Oh.
My boundaries,
I don't want to have to talk for so long. I don't want to have to talk for so long.
So,
Okay,
so here
yeah.
is maybe What's in and out, maybe we can make it short because we could go on.
Yeah. So the education gap, we don't see it as an education gap. We see it as a cultural capital. Because so what's going on in those cases that you talked about, the makerspace and the food swap, is there are people who are basically trying to show, distinguishing practices, as Bourdieu would say. So it's not that the people don't know. I mean, they don't know how to do it in the way that these people are telling. But there is a big education gap in terms of if you look at the people in our samples are super high educated. So that's where. And as it scales, that'll come down.
Okay.
What's in and what's out. Okay, so Zipcar is not a case. That Relay Rides is a case. Zipcar talks about itself as a sharing, and I left out one of the slides that would make some of this. I agree with you, these are not the only conditions. So I think also for-profit and non-profit is very important. And so that's, I would have talked about that. But the what's in and what's out, Airbnb, I mean, I don't, as I said, we didn't call it the sharing economy to begin with. And so I don't like that term in a lot of ways, because I think it's, I think what Airbnb is doing is not really that much in the way of sharing. But what's interesting to me, I was just thinking about this, that with the nonprofits, this is the thing about our nonprofit cases is they're not scaling. There are ways in which the founders or the staff or whatever of the nonprofits are organizing things such that they're not really working that well for the participants. So we don't have robust trading economies in them. They're falling apart. And that's where in a true peer-to-peer, so a truly, because a nonprofit is not a democratically governed thing. In a democratically governed initiative, you would hopefully be able to figure that out and get the things right so that, I mean, maybe not, but I think you'd have a better shot at it. So that's one reason I like the peer-to-peer, because I like democratically governed economic institutions, which nonprofits aren't. It's not to say that nonprofits can't participate in this and provide, and as I say, these cases that we have, I mean, the makerspace is wonderful in the sense that it provides tools and a place and community and all of that, but they have some, we didn't get into all the problems in that paper. We're focusing on one, but there are real issues, and in that space, there are also issues between the members of the board and so forth. In the piece that's going to be on the website, I talk about also what I call G to P, government to peer, because in a true democracy, G is peer to peer. So yes, I mean, and especially at a local level where you can have a peer production process. Almost all those things you suggested are digitally enabled. They may not take advantage of all the digital features, but there's hardly anything these days that isn't digital. And I don't think going forward there will be much that isn't digital. In the sense that it just reduces those transactions costs. So the tool libraries, I'm pretty sure, have a digital dimension. So yes, they don't have to be sort of all the way, but I do think for the transactions costs, it's important. Meetups, yeah, one of our education cases that I think meetups have been part of the participant observation, and definitely that's an interesting thing. I don't think that I don't think value change is a primary motivation, what's driving people to participate in the monetized parts of it. And I do think that in things like the makerspace, the time bank, the food swap, it's the emergence of a new, you could call it a new set of values. I'm sure I gave you our paper on this, which is the emergence of this eco-habitus. So, but it's not values driven in the way that social sciences think, kind of political science, values drive behavior. It's a new here's another thing I didn't get to. It's a new configuration of the Bourdieusian map. Here's Bourdieu, high and low cultural capital, low and high economic capital. This one's backwards from the way it's usually done. Hold on. Here we have it. Economic capital high, economic capital low, cultural capital high, cultural capital low. So this is the food space and how tastes array in the space of food. And the nonprofit, the sharing economy starts down here where a lot of innovation, consumer innovation starts, and it's moving up here. Eventually we move up here. That's value change in the way we understand it. So and there's some other things that are happening which we talk about in that paper. There is an emergence of what we call an eco-habitus, in which different things are valued in the consumer space. High cultural capital tastes are different than they were 30, 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Doug Holt's coming here next month. You could talk to him about that too. But he's an absolute expert on this. But that's the way I would say it's value change. It's not in that sort of, people had to change a
worldview, right? That's not a worldview.
It is a world. It's their basic sensibilities of taste that are changing, and that's the way I see values working out in the consumption space.
Okay, let's move to the next three people in line. That there will be Kit, there will be Mori, and another hands up. Hold on.
This is a question about the interstices between public space and private space. And there is a court case that's going out in San Francisco where someone has developed a cell phone app that allows you to say, I'm leaving parking space.
Monkey parking.
Right. So are they selling information or are they selling public parking spaces? I believe that's I was wondering what your take on that was. Was that part of the sharing economy? But then perhaps the bigger question, this is all enabled by the digital world, so to what degree is the digital world good? And then just a comment that one of the oldest ways of recycling goods has been the pawn shop, and perhaps the most predatory. When I used to teach money and banking, I would always talk about the difference between the prime rate and the pawn rate. And so are predatory institutions part of the sharing economy broadly defined?
Mori?
Just quickly, inasmuch as many of the sharing platforms are functioning effectively as brokers, and brokers throughout history are in a vulnerable position because if the buyers and sellers get together, without them, they're cut out of the transaction. And whether there's any, particularly coming out of any of your field work, whether there's indications that either through repeat transactions or referrals, people are bypassing Airbnb, for instance, and getting together to negotiate those deals between themselves.
Yeah, as you were talking about sort of the maize and the slice that gets taken by the apps or the owners of the apps, I'm thinking about work I've done around value chain analysis and global value chain. And I suppose in some ways it's just a more sophisticated understanding of Marxist extraction and appropriation of value. And that's, you're putting the focus here on the governance. How much value are these apps extracting? And certainly you can sort of just look at the competition, say, between Lyft and Uber in the private space, but it's also about their exclusivity and the technological sophistication. And could that potentially be in the, say, the open source area? I mean, who owns this stuff? Is it non-profit or not? And I just find that interesting. I think a value chain type of analysis of the bargaining power and the ability to set, I mean, I suppose I'm coming at it with a business strategy head, right? But that is, very much the ability to extract a slice of the value comes down to the bargaining power and the exclusivity and maybe the technological sophistication. Just a couple of side things, if you have a chance, maybe not now, but as a larger political movement, we always think about, you talked a bit about how much values are changing, but overall, is this just a co-optation of lefty values, or do you think, I try and be on Gramsci's optimism of the will side here, that there is an opportunity here to mobilize the technophiles and other people into a sort of a larger coalition and move them in a direction as a social movement, not just as an economic thing here. I'll leave it at that. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, it's a great question. So the monkey parking, I think it was immediately declared illegal, and we had some back and forth. I think Will is the one who sent it to us. It's awful. Monkey parking is awful.
They're trying version of it in Boston.
Yeah, right. But I think, we believe very strongly the idea of the digital world as a public space, as a public commons, and of course lots of people have written about that and are working on that and so forth. But I think that's really key, and partly it's that kind of sensibility that we're trying to bring to these consumption activities. The brokers, the platforms as brokers, that's a great question. We do see some of that, and I'm hearing about it anecdotally. We don't know how much, but for sure. And that gets into David's question, which is sort of how much power do the platforms have? And I think the question of, because that ultimately is going to determine this. So one part of me has that optimistic hat on, where I talked about the home health care aides, so that, there's nothing to stop them from doing this. And I'm thinking also about the National Freelancers Union, which has begun to develop partnerships with some of these platforms. And if you think, okay, not just the providers organize, because if you only organize the providers, then you have the problem of, are they going to exploit the consumers? You actually want to have all of the users, I think, as part of the governance structure. But, so what is it that would prevent? And if you sort of think about it theoretically, you think, well, there shouldn't be that much to prevent new entrants into this space, because the software isn't that complicated, et cetera. It won't take you that long to get a critical mass. You don't need to have the entire world on your space, et cetera. And yet, when you think about the digital world, look at what's happened. It's just platform after platform scales to monopoly. So why? I don't know enough about the economics of that yet to know the answer to that, but that's what I worry about, that they are, once you get those network externalities, it's the network externalities, it's just, you can't do it, and I don't understand why. Now, it may be different in these cases than, say, a search engine or a social network site. I'm not sure. Or it may be that they just, some people say, well, when you get that much money, the software, it isn't that expensive, and it just stays that much ahead of the game, and then people would have to be willing to have sort of, this solidarity sector sharing economy is the poor cousin, which is, ultimately not going to get us where we want to go. Co-optation of lefty values, absolutely. We'll see where it's going. But what was interesting is how many leftists jumped onto this so fast and are still, some of them are still hanging in there. And then you also have people who are just saying, oh, it's a fraud, it's a hype, there are a lot of progressives who have soured on it, I think. And I try, in the essay that's coming out, I try and talk about that question of this sort of co-optation. Is it something that got co-opted, or I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, so we have Rick, but we had Ruby waiting, and I don't remember your name. Rob, Ruby, and Joe. And then your turn will be next. Okay, so please take the questions.
I was wondering if you could talk about what you see as the potential for actually reducing consumption and ecological impact. It seems like in the cases, a lot of the motivation was people looking for more meaningful relationships or perhaps a different meaning towards consumption. I'm wondering if you see any cases or conditions that actually lead to reduced consumption and reduced environmental impact.
Well,
So my question has to do with, is the sharing economy always going to be around the margins of the economy, in that when people are looking at trying to reduce their costs, that you've got industries that are highly consolidated and have economy of scale will always drive the price down. So they're impervious to sharing because they will always be less expensive.
I was just wondering if you looked at the implications, say, in an emerging economy, if this is supposed to help make things more inclusive. Is there room for this? You know, I'm thinking of things like the green phone ladies, where they use a phone and they rent it out as a means. So I just wondered if it had been looked at in emerging markets. The second part was any link to the circular economy or this new this idea that some of the big corporations, so looking at this idea of the circular economy. And then the third was actually picking back off that one. If it does lead to a reduction in consumption, what are the implications for economic growth?
we have,
So,
does it lead to,
does it lead to less consumption? I don't think so. There are a couple of reasons why. This point I made earlier, it makes goods and services cheaper. And when it makes things that make goods and services cheaper, generally would lead to more consumption. So one of the things we see in the Airbnb case is people who talk about how they can travel more, both because they're earning more through Airbnb, or they rent out their $400 a night apartment in Back Bay, and then they fly to another city and rent a $100 Airbnb, or how Airbnb is funding travel and so forth. It also makes travel less expensive. In the car case, I think that the existence of lower cost automobile transportation in cities is probably leading to more of it. And there's one paper on Craigslist that Anders Fremstad, who's a grad student, PhD student at UMass Economics in Amherst, really good person writing on the sharing economy. He did find lower landfills, lower garbage as a result of Craigslist. I mean, the data's really complicated to put all these things together because it's a hard thing to figure out. But so I think, again, it probably really varies across the platform and the type of things. I mean, if you're talking about time banks and maker spaces and food swaps, the answer is yes, probably it does. And certainly to less monetized consumption and lower footprint stuff. There are other effects too, though. If it allows people to live without formal sector jobs, it might lower their household footprint, for example. So it's a really complicated question. I went around and around and around with an entrepreneur who's developing a company it's an app, and when you go to buy something, it tells you, and he's starting in outdoor gear. You go to buy it and it tells you what its resale price is on the resale markets. And so his idea, he's coming out of he's a big environmentalist, and he thinks this is going to have a good environmental impact because people are going to buy better quality, more durable things when they know they can resell them. So, but what is this really doing? It's reducing the cost of purchasing these really expensive things, which means that people are, I just can't think of an economic model that is going to lead to less consumption as a result of this, because people are just going to churn these things and then they're going to sell them, and they're going to probably end up being exported, like we have seen with apparel. And David, you may have another point of view here.
Yeah, I don't understand how, just intrinsically, if there's a market for more durable stuff, and that's actually signaled, you have certificates or whatever, but so the stuff lasts longer and more people are using it along the chain instead of just throwing it away when it's a year or two old, I don't understand why that doesn't, at least intuitively.
Because it lowers the cost of purchasing. So now instead of the cost being $500, it's really only $400.
But it lowers the cost
It's
of...
really only $100 because you can resell it for $400 a year later, and for $100 you buy it, and then you sell it and buy another one the next year.
But, okay. But it also lowers the cost of secondhand relative to new. So I think it's a complex question. It's not...
Yeah. Anyway, that is definitely true. It's a complex question.
Yeah.
And I think that it's not at all obvious, but in general, here's another point about this. These platforms are advertising the fact that they're creating jobs, they're giving people more money, all of those things. And that's all for the monetized ones. That's true. And if that's true, that particularly in a depressed economy, what it most likely means is they're expanding economic activity, which means they're increasing footprint and they're increasing consumption relative to. And I think just the provision of sort of new, cheaper markets high-quality, low-cost markets in today's environment where you have lots of people who have diminished earning power, more price sensitivity and so forth, to me, speaks increases. So I don't think it'll reduce consumption, therefore I'm not, economic growth. Is it always going to be on the margins? No, I don't think so. I think it's coming into the center for sure, particularly the big platforms. And in the emerging economies, well, you have a lot of this happening non-digitally in the emerging economies, in the informal sector. You also have these platforms moving into emerging economies. You can go online. I was looking, the explosion of sharing in the Arab world and here and there, sharing in Latin America, etc. So probably what's happening is the digital, the for-profit companies are going in and they're attracting the the higher parts of the middle class. But they're expanding all over the place. I was in Brazil a few months ago, and people are really interested in this. It's come to Brazil, etc.
I'd like to give an opportunity. So let's ask questions, short questions and short answers. Rich has been waiting. Have you? Okay. Fred, John, and Alan. All right. If they are related, we'll handle all four of them. If not, we'll worry about it.
Are we at time?
We have 15 minutes.
Okay.
And if none of it answers my questions, I'll answer them to us.
So mine falls right on David's in terms of this network issue. So around here I'm known as Mr. Market Power. I've done some work in the field in electricity. But anyway, in terms of networks, I participated in another example, homeexchange.com. Okay, well, it's absolutely clear, even though the initial cost was minimal to join, so it's like an annual membership. It was $50, now it's suddenly jumped to $100. Okay, you might see where I'm going. So you're buying the network, 40,000, homes you can exchange with, okay, as much as you want in a year. You can't suddenly start a new competitive business, even if, say, they double their fee from 100 to 200, right, and exercise that kind of market power, because you can't suddenly switch 40,000 people to a new network. It might happen slowly, but in the meantime, you're going to want to stay on the network. So I think this is a kind of model that I think you're worrying about. I think you said the network issue was a factor, but I think it may be more powerful than you said, or maybe I didn't hear you correctly.
I have two disparate comments which hopefully will fit together. I spent a long time studying democratic workplaces, a project at Harvard School of Education with Larry Kohlberg, who thought that working in a democratic workplace would change people's values and so forth. That was disappointing. What we found is that the more democratic these workplaces were, the faster they failed, and the faster they fell out of the research literature. Everybody wanted to write about them going up. Nobody wanted to write about them going down. I think in order for democratic, including this peer-to-peer stuff, to be effective, it's got to solve various problems of the stagnation of democratic peer-to-peer relations. And I just want to throw in one kind of recent article by this woman, Catherine Phillips, about diversity in the workplace. What she finds is that diversity in the workplace is private corporation, a big plus for productivity. If you have women on the boards, if you've got all these groups which are mixed class, mixed race. The other thing she found is that people actually don't like it. They want their old boy and their old girl network. Here you've got private capital, which has said diversity is pushing productivity. We want it even though the people being diversified don't. And that's one of the ways in which, not the only way, but it's provocative because it's private enterprise, understanding the stagnating tendencies of peer relations, and it's a problem I don't know how to solve, but
And that speaks to this stratification that you observed. John?
Yeah, I guess mine are more comments than questions, though I'm curious to hear whether you think these two things are important. First of all, with respect to the cheapening of prices, I think that's an important effect, but I think there's another important effect, moral licensure. So take the person who would more cheaply vacation in France because they can get an Airbnb apartment. They also can tell themselves that they're doing the green thing because they're not contributing to the hotel industry. And I wonder how important you think that is. The other is the way these platforms transform markets. So in the auto industry now, people don't buy cars. They buy newness and usedness. So there's a market for newness, and that's serviced through leasing. And there's a market for usedness, and that's serviced through resale. And so the way the auto industry became a finance industry and changed the auto market made a whole different way of selling things. They can now sell cars, which if you actually looked at the sticker price, you wouldn't think they'd be affordable. But that's routinely what they sell. And I wonder if that is going to happen here. If what you're going to see are these platforms carefully segmenting, taking things which look like unitary things, like cars, and segmenting them to newness and usedness, creating new markets which only they can service.
Just quickly, definition, comment, governance comment, and ownership comment, I guess. Let me start with the last one. My personal experience, my daughter founded City Car Share in San Francisco, a nonprofit. Now competes with Zipcar and Enterprise car sharing and this car sharing and that car sharing. They stayed the course as a nonprofit. They've survived and done reasonably well, but in the face of stiff competition, they're a values-driven organization. So speaking to whoever my colleague here raised the question of values, this is a case where the values have trumped the incentives to sell out, basically, because they could have done that 100 times over. So they're staying the course, and it's an interesting anecdote about how values can overshadow or rise to the occasion, if you will. The second thing is the question of intermediation. I think Maury raised this. Really, a lot of the platforms are exercises in, it seems, redefining, reconstituting intermediation. So when you have these financial Times recently reported this yesterday, I think these you contribute dollars, you get the share dollars, you build your credit, avoiding banks altogether. So you can get rid of the bankers. We talk about over-financialization of the economy, but if you can construct systems that reduce the role of banking altogether in the extreme case, then you're definancializing the economy and you're increasing the direct consumer to produce a consumer relationship. And then finally, I'm just thinking of an elevator definition of what this is about. So here's my elevator definition. Digital activation of idle and or underutilized assets with or without a monetizing quality or attribute.
Well, you have a range of questions here that I can ask.
Market power and the networks. So I think, these days it's not that hard to get 80,000 people online. And so a competitor to your home exchange I don't think is probably that hard to develop. One of the things that's happening now is there are startups who are specializing in the ratings and reputational profiles of people. I mean, I don't think they're operating too much yet, but we're just starting to look at this. So that means one of the key things that the networks have could possibly be, or that the platforms have, could possibly be taken away from that. So I mean, I can definitely see both sides to sort of how hard is it? You think about some of these networks, MySpace, which is gone, and Facebook totally dominated them, and a lot of networks that fail and other networks take their places. So I think there's possibility for network switching, and maybe people are going to be doing more of that in the future. Of course, the platforms are going to try their damnedest to make it really hard for people to do that, and we'll see. I don't know. I feel like I don't know how it's going to work out. On the workplace stuff, I mean, I think that the literature is definitely varied on this. I mean, you have a whole literature. I don't know the education literature. I do know a little more of the economics literature on productivity and worker-owned and worker-controlled factories being considerably higher. I think there are probably kind of excess of democracy situations where too much transactional dimensions, too many meetings, conflicts happen. I guess the point I would make is no structure is perfect. Every structure has its problems. So whether it's, you get the benefits of diversity, you have the flip side of it, or you have the benefits of democracy, you have the flip side of it. I mean, I think right now, problems of concentration of power and resources are paramount, as well as what's happening in terms of the planetary ecology, and I think those two things are very much related. So it's not a panacea by any means. I just think these are better ways to organize economic activity. The way we are currently organizing so much of our economic activity is really problematic. So we've got to work on different ways. And I think this is peer-to-peer, to me, is a very promising way based on what we've seen around us over the last 20 plus years. Maybe it's 30, I'm not sure. Moral licensure, I think that's definitely happening. On the other hand, I would say the fraction of people participating in this who actually care about their footprint in a serious way is probably not that high. And yes, segmenting into newness and useness, that makes a lot of sense to me. And they'll be figuring out sort of which angle, I mean, the for-profits will be figuring out sort of which part of this they can actually really make the money on. And congratulations for having a daughter. It's spending your time doing that. And thank you for the other, I love the definition.
Well, we're coming to an end, so maybe kind of an observation based on all this. So what I hear from you, Julie, is that reduce consumption, forget it. There may be some marginal reductions here or there, but it's not a game changer. That's not, at least the way it's taking shape. Reducing the boundaries, the cultural boundaries, exclusion, inclusion, something that Fred touched upon and your research showed so blatantly. I was angry at these people. I'm not going to bring my food to them. But it was a very striking thing, right? The culture. So a lot of hype or hope about the sharing economy was that because it's a personal interaction, that it's going to form some basis for us acting as really as a group when we turn our sights on what's wrong with this economy or so. It does not bring that promise. I heard something promising about ability of people who are like home aid workers who could skip over the intermediary, right? And believe me, I see the bills that the $8.50 an hour girl who was helping my mother, and then I see how much Medicare paid for it. It was 10 times more, literally. After the agency that was hired by another agency, Okay, so there is a hope here, a true economic well-being of some group of people, but of course, we institutionalize the system in such a way it's not going to be so simple. Reimbursements, who gets reimbursement? But there is a hope for economic, right? So, does anybody else see a hope for a real social change, and in what direction through these new forms of economic activity? Oh, there are some short, because we're running out of time. You have an answer? Propose.
Not an answer, just a little bit of hope. That's
it?
Well, I just think that it shifts the discourse, that people are talking about it, some people are critiquing it, but there's something in the air that stirs things up, and that has some power in and of
So
itself.
it mixes the pot. We don't know.
Yeah.
I think Julie's example of Firefox and some of these open source, commonly sourced resources are good, because something like Firefox immediately breaks the monopoly of Microsoft and other big companies. So there's some hope in that direction, a bigger commons.
And mine relates to this, I think, and that is, I think defining the tent as so large and so many tents may be problematic. I think a more narrow definition of a true sharing economy, which I believe does either imply or require value shifts, has hope, but that is very marginal, and that's not coming into the center. It's these kind of large monetized ones that are. So anyway, I think a redefinition, if you will.
So I do want to just be clear about the consumption reduction issue, which is the thing I said at the end, because as I understood the question, will these things on their own be the impetus for reducing consumption? And there I see a lot of question marks, and maybe not. But if you ask it in a different way, will these help facilitate well-being in an environment in which consumption is being reduced? I think the answer is absolutely yes. So they become a facilitating condition for, and I think we're on that path for most people. We're on a path of reduced consumption, not for the people, we've got a concentrated income and wealth up there, people who are increasing their consumption. But if you look at what's happening to the majority, so I think they are part of a reduced consumption pathway. It's just that you can't control rebound effects and second and third round effects and so forth without doing something about the rate of growth of the economy. I guess that would be the way I would put it. I'm not as worried about the social distinction as, the paper, of course, we're giving the paradox in its starkest form, like these are supposed to be places of egalitarian social relations, and look at how people are acting. We shouldn't be surprised about that. That's the world we live in. So, and it doesn't mean that they're not better than the places that aren't even places of, places where there's no pretense or no even attempt at more openness and equality and so forth. So they are better, and and if you went to the food swap, you wouldn't feel it on the surface so much as the paper lets you feel. We're being sociological there, and we're kind of probing a little bit to what's underneath this, or will space, which will look a lot more friendly on the outside. You kind of have to. So I am hopeful. I mean, I think for the reasons that David said, and I just think that ultimately sharing has to be at the core of what we are about. And I agree with James's point. Let's figure out which of these activities are really taking us in the direction we want to go. But I think let's also try and learn from the ones that are growing rapidly, because the ones that are sort of just set up along the things that, you know, lefties think are the way to set these things up, they are not. That's not happening with them. They're having a lot more problems. So what can we learn from what these other platforms are doing to try and create innovations that actually will attract lots of people?
Well, thank you very much.